Thank you very much for coming. This afternoon, I want to express my appreciation
Goldman,
to Kate Goldman,
quien no
who
añadió
has added
la descripción que
in the
fuimos ambos estudiantes
inscription
graduados
into
del programa de
the
literatura hispanoamericana de
introduction that
Rutgers y
we studied
tenemos
together at
una
Rutgers
amistad muy
University, and we have
estrecha
a very
desde
strong,
hace
long
cientos años.
friendship for many
Eh,
years.
y bueno, también a
And of
Erika Durante
course,
por
Erica,
participar y ser cómplice
since she's been
de
an
esta
accomplice and
iniciativa, este
participated in
programa
this
tan interesante de
initiation of
charlas
this
que estoy
program, of
seguro
these
les va a
very
dejar mucho
interesting
que
series
pensar
of workshops that will
por
give
parte de
you a lot to think
intelectuales
about
que están en el campo.
intellectually
Yo creo que los
about what's
periodistas de
happening
esta época
in the
son gente muy
campus.
preparada en
The
muchos casos
journalism of this time
y
are very
tienen un
prepared. The
conocimiento de
journalists of this
primera
time are
mano de
very
situaciones que son
prepared
muy
and have
complejas de
some
explicar.
understanding of very
Por eso me
complex
parece tan
situations that are
importante que
challenging
se
to
hagan este
explain.
tipo
That's why it's so
de
important that we have
iniciativas. También
initiatives
quiero dar
like
las
this one. I
gracias
also want to
a
thank
Iria. Nos conocemos
Idia.
hace
We've
mucho
known each
tiempo, en
other for a
efecto.
long time.
Teníamos años sin
We
vernos.
haven't seen each other in
eh,
years.
y ambos tenemos
And we
como,
both have,
digamos,
how do we
historia,
say,
como
stories
contexto.
and
Una época de
context
debates
of
sobre la democracia
debates
muy
about
intensos en
democracy
Venezuela
and
en
the
los años 80,
intensity of it in
cuando
Venezuela
todavía
during the
no
1980s,
veíamos muy
where we
bien el
didn't
tsunami
really
que
see the
iba
tsunami
a destruir el
that
país
would
en un
destroy
año.
the country like it has destroyed it in the
Entonces,
last 20
bueno,
years.
eso es. Muchas
And
gracias
so, thank you.
por
That's
venir
that's it. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for coming. I also thank Erica Durante and Kate Goldman for inviting me to be a part of this meeting with Boris Muñoz. And in the beginning, we talked about Boris would have a conference, and in the end, it turned out to be more of like a conversation, not really an interview, because interviewing a journalist could be very challenging, but it's going to be more of a conversation where I will give some my ideas, triggering ideas, so that Boris can comment about his expressions that have to do with the journalism, literature, migration, and of course the polarization and erosion of democracy. That is a topic that I'm very interested in intellectually as a researcher, but also as a living, because it's part of our biography. It's like Boris just said, it hasn't at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, when we were innocent. Now we're not as innocent. And during that time, there has been this trajectory of events where there's been this role, this you've developed your abilities as a journalist. I would love to know, to start this conversation, what are three moments that have moved you from that young person that studied at the Central University of Venezuela to the prized professional that lives today? What are those three moments that were key points in that trajectory? That's a question for a few days of reflection before even opening my mouth. But I would venture off to say that there are historical moments and things that become personal moments, and then there are personal moments that define this trajectory or evolution, personal evolution in life. I think that the important event in Caracas, in Venezuela, now we're seeing that in Ecuador there has been this wave of social protests with vandalism and repression that was caused by the removal of the gas and gasoline and the economic package that was required by the international economy to sort of emit this $1.4 million. So in Venezuela, something like that was happening in regards to the economic system that really just generated this intense wave in many left behind many deaths that have not happened, of course, in Ecuador. But this event that was inaugural, it started this time that has marked Venezuela even up until today, which really sparked the rise of Hugo Chavez into power, which we would have never seen. We just thought at that time that there was this intense debate about the quality of the democratic system, and there was this critical aspect, this general aspect towards the political system of two parties that were dominating the scene, and the issues that were happening behind all of that game, and that really just sparked this series of not reflections, but of different moments, that narrative moments in my personal life that really brought you in confrontation with the country where you were, and just made you feel that you were so different. It was so different from this middle class perspective where I was living, and there was this lack of association, social association, that, not the worst, but there was hunger and there was corruption, and all of that manifested after that event, which also demonstrated that democracy was very fragile and could be broken from the inside through the political system when repressive actions were being taken, like the ones that were taken, and that left behind so many dead, and really left the possibility of insurgents, of the insurgents of a radical left, which was really sitting inside the university spaces in Venezuela, and eventually found its messiahs in Hugo Chavez. And that event really marked the personal life and also the possibilities of a future in Venezuela, because as things began to evolve in '89, which really coincides with the fall of the Berlin Wall and other things that happened around the world, which had very culminating moments, that coincide with Hugo Chavez rising to power 10 years later, and really made me analyze my role in Venezuela, and forced me to look for another horizon, which is what I did in 1996. And that event really helped me determine in that sense. And then secondly was my arrival at Rutgers, where we studied. Because for many reasons, it was the opening of a much more enriching educational experience, and joyful, pleasurable, which connected me with the possibility to understand two things that were isolated in my own experience. One was the journalism formation. I am an accidental journalist, I think. It was journalism happened to me. It wasn't something that I was hoping or wishing for. And the lecturing, the literature the literature knowledge that came when I decided to get a doctorate in Pan-American journalism, and I had an immense pleasure to be protected, quote unquote, by two people that today I would say are like angels in the symbolic words, which was Tomás Luis Martínez, and which was a journalist, and his Venezuelan wife, who were the ones that received me at Rutgers and accompanied me through this intellectual trajectory. So I think that's also another personal event, that marked a new story. And then lastly, since you said there were three, I think The third would be my return to the United States, because after finishing my doctorate in 2003 at Rutgers, after a month of defending my thesis, I returned to Venezuela, in part because I didn't want to lose the story that was happening in my country. I didn't want them to tell me what the revolution was, if the revolution was happening, what Hugo Chavez was happening. I wanted to know more than what was being told to me. I wanted to experience it. I wanted to witness it. And so I returned to Venezuela, and for 6 years I worked as a journalist almost exclusively. I was also an educator at the university level, but primarily my job was to be a journalist, to write for the different mediums, and etc. And then in 6 years, this new stage happens where I had the opportunity to come back to the United States through the scholarship NEOM to go to Harvard, and it just started this newness where I was very unclear. My family and I stayed in the United States, not conscious of the fact that we were exiled at the beginning, but every new month, let's just say, it was headed more and more towards authoritative sort of regime under Hugo Chavez. And within me, I became conscious that that I didn't know what was going to happen with Venezuela, and that it would become more and more difficult to be a journalist freely there. And so personally, I questioned, what do I do? Do I return to Venezuela, or do I do journalism about Venezuela while living in the United States? And that was a lesson that was challenging. It was weird. I would say that it was contradictory, but it worked. And so that really marks this last decade. I came to the United States in 2009, and I'm completing my 10th year. It's been a very enriching experience, and journalism has been my destiny. And I ended up as the editor of the Spanish opinions in the New York Times, which has been an enriching experience that I never looked for. It was just another one of those things that just happened, and that you can't possibly explain completely without saying that there is this dose of luck, in the positive sense, and a dose of destiny, and destiny in regard to will and life and the things that life begins to place in your path. And that would be it. I thought I would finish this conversation asking you, how do you qualify yourself? How do you qualify us? Are we migrants, expatriates, exiled? And you've gotten ahead that when you returned to the United States, you stated that you didn't realize that you weren't exiled. So you have qualified yourself as exiled. What was that process to come to the United States as a fellow, and 10 years later recognize yourself as an exile? It was a process. I became conscious of that relatively soon, maybe a year and a half to 2 years of surviving here, because the Neiman grant was like paradise, but it is a paradise that only lasts for 10 months. After that, it's done. And if you don't have another way of staying, it's like falling into reality from a very high place. And so I definitely had a lot of luck. Harvard gave me other grants, and so thanks to that, I was able to navigate from one year to the next with a high peculiar level, but with a visa, which is really the central issue here, is the legality. How do you stay legally in a country where that's very limited by the jurisdiction process. And I was very lucky, of course, to that it allowed me to reflect personally. Like I said before, in Venezuela, journalism is very, very compromised. It's isolated.
los medios han empezado
The
a hacer agua.
mediums are beginning to create waters to collapse,
Yo lo vi
like
muy
they
claramente.
succeed, like they have. I wrote about it. I criticized it. I saw it happen, and you have to reinvent. The reinvention is
Accidentadas, improvisadas,
accidental,
pero no
improvised
del todo.
sometimes, but not
Bueno, uno
all the
fue
way. And
buscando
so
cómo,
you go little
cómo
by little figuring
abrir,
out
crearte un
how do
espacio
you open a
en ese exilio,
space
en ese
in that
condición.
exile,
Una
in
vez
that
exiliado, que
condition, that
además
new exiled
es muy
condition,
difícil de comprender
where
para
it's
nosotros,
very difficult,
si
which
no
is
hay una
very difficult to
sensibilidad
understand for
más o menos
yourself
previa y un conocimiento
without any prior
de donde uno proviene.
knowledge or
Digamos que hoy se entiende
provisions
muy
from the place where
claramente
you come
que
from. I
Venezuela es
mean,
una
today we
tragedia,
understand
una
that
tragedia
Venezuela is an
que está
apocalypse, that
global,
it's a tragedy at the global level,
destrucción de un
that there's
país
a
que
destruction
era
of
uno de
a
los más
country that was
ricos
one of the
de la
richest
región,
in the
producto de una
region. It
destrucción
was
casi
it's a
absoluta.
destruction that
Somos un
is
país
almost
que no está
absolute.
en guerra, pero
It's
es como
a
si lo
country
estuviera.
that is not in at war, but it's almost like
Eso se
it
entiende hoy,
is. And
después
that's
del
what we
año
understand
2014,
today. After
15 empezó a
2014,
entenderse eso,
after
pero
2015, we began to
cuando
understand
hace
that.
9 años
But
todo el mundo
9 years
pensaba
ago,
que
everyone
mu-
thought, not everyone
mucha
thought,
gente
but
podía pensar
many people
incluso
could
en la
have
izquierda
thought
liberal
that the
de Estados
liberal
Unidos que
left of
Hugo
the United
Chávez
States,
era realmente un
that Hugo
revolucionario
Chavez was a
que iba
revolutionist
a
that would
contrarrestar el efecto de Estados Unidos en
counteract the
América
effect
Latina
of the
y
United
crear
States
un
on Latin
paradigma
America and
socialista,
create this
¿verdad?
socialist
Para mí era claro
paradise.
que eso
I
era una
thought
guerra
that that
ficción.
was a
Eh,
gravely fictional.
y eso no se
And
entendía,
so
pero
that's not
bueno,
that
o
wasn't the
sea, sucedió
understanding.
que la
And so
vida
what happened is
dio
that
las
life
oportunidades y
gave
de hecho
opportunities,
parte de
and
la parte más arriesgada de
part
esa reinvención
most of
personal,
those
digamos, fue
risky
escribir en una
parts of
segunda
that
lengua,
was writing in a
empezar a
different
escribir en
language.
inglés, que para
Begin
mí
to
es
write
una
in
experiencia
English,
muy
which is a
difícil,
very difficult experience
igual que
for
ser
me,
editor en inglés, para
especially
mí es
as being an
una tarea
editor
muy
in English
difícil
is a
todos los
very
días, me
hard
pone a
task
prueba,
for me every single
eh,
day. It
pero
challenges
había que
me,
hacerlo
but
porque
it had to be
como
done
dice
because,
mi mamá que
like my
murió
mom
hace
said,
algunos años,
who died a few
tenía
years ago, I
una especie
had a
de ¿cómo se dice? Refrán en inglés,
she had several
sí, un personal saying que
sayings.
era la necesidad tiene
The
cara de perro.
necessity has the
Y
face of
eso
a
quiere decir
dog, and
que
that means
en momentos
that in
de
moments
grandes pruebas
of great
uno tiene que
trial,
salir
you have
adelante
to pull
haciendo
ahead,
prácticamente
doing
cualquier cosa,
whatever
incluso
it
lo menos pensado.
even
Para
what
mí
you
lo menos
least thought
pensado
of.
era
The
escribir
For
en
me, the
inglés
least thing I
y
ever
por
thought of
supuesto
was
escribir
writing
de
in
inglés y bueno,
English and
ahí me
obviously
vi
being a
con
journalist in
antecedentes
English.
de
And but I found myself
justamente
in those
eso, de
situations
moverse
because
no de
of
placer
survival
estético.
needs, not
Y
really because it was
bueno,
something that was
algo
pleasurable
salió
to
bien.
me, but something came out
Entonces,
good, right?
bueno, son esos pequeños
So it's those
actos que
little
van
acts
creando una
that go
situación.
creating a situation. It's almost like this accidental journalist career has come out pretty well because you did receive the Maria Morse-Scott Prize for your work at the New York Times, but there are things that haven't gone that well. Of course, like the New York Times canceled the Spanish their Spanish newspaper right after you got that prize. It's almost like they show that there's two things that happen one after the other are not causable, but effectually you can say that in response to this prize there is this canceling of this of the New York Times. I'm not going to ask you in regards to the decision, which I don't know anything about, and of course it wouldn't be correct to debate that here, but I did want to ask you, what do you think would be necessary for there to be this journalist offer for the Spanish community here in the United States? One thing that I read and I enjoyed was in the New York Times Spanish and had to do with the literature world, with the journalist world. Latin Americans were saying that the reason was that the population in the United States wasn't reading, that they didn't read newspapers, that they didn't have that level of education. How do you react to that? to that comment? And what do you think is necessary to challenge those prejudgments that could exist within different environments and do a job that captures the Spanish market, which is huge? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but before I lose this idea, I just really want to get it out. I do want to say that I think is a mistake to close the New York Times in Spanish, and an error was for it to be done the way that it was done, which was very abrupt. There was no announcement for the people that did the work, and also I found it to be an ironic vision that to argue that it was for financial reasons. Really, we were a very successful medium in every metric way of the word, because the metrics really determine the impact and the possibility to be successful in the market in regards to the mediums and the organizational mediums. And in all those value indexes, the New York Times in Spanish was very successful. So I wanted to make that clear. I think it is an issue, and it responds to your question, and it responds to what I think is happening. I think that it's an issue, a vision issue. It's understanding that in the United States, there are over 60 million Spanish speaking people. It's the second greatest place to speak Spanish besides Latin America, way over even Spain. And so, not to bet specifically in the long term, because with the mediums you have to really do things in the long term, because they're very hard to establish and to rent economically. So you have to think of margins of 5 to 10 years. You cannot think of things in 1, 2, or even 3 years. For example, the New York Times in Spanish, we were entering into a mature stage. We were in a mature stage to start a new stage, to look for other income and earning streams. And so I also believe that at this time, there are issues with the Latinos or the Hispanics have become very relevant because of the confrontational nature of President Trump, with the descendants of Latin America. I don't really know how else to say it. It's very important to understand that there's this public that is sitting there waiting for information to be offered that is quality information to be offered that will create a movement, a social movement inside the American society. And I believe that there's this wait for it. And I believe that the New York Times is starting to understand that, for example, in this moment. There's this look towards the 2020 elections where immigration, and bilateral relationships, Mexico, United States, Central America, and also United States and Venezuela, and United States and Cuba are going to moreover have a bigger part in the political agenda. Right now, the Democratic debates haven't really treated the Latin American issues, but I think that is going to happen. I think that is a window to begin to create, from the point of view, a great opportunity to develop new mediums like ProPublic, like the New York Times in Spanish, in English. It will continue to translate part of the material that is produced over about the issues that have to do with Latin America and the Latinos in the United States. and other organizations that also publish in Spanish, like the New Yorker has started to publish some pieces in Spanish. We would think that those are great mediums that have high caliber, that are starting to understand more. They're becoming more adventurous, not in a way that is conscious or in detail, but that is happening. So what I believe is a vision, what is necessary to understand that market, that audience is out there, and the audiences are formed. It's not entities that are there naturally. You go creating them through cultivation, the cultivating of relationships, of cultivating those communities that are marginalized. So if there's a consisting bet that will grab not just in at the state level or national. For example, in Texas, they publish in Spanish or in the Miami Herald, but a medium that has a more ample vision. I think that there is a place for there to be fruits there. I hope that. I think that the Latino vote can impact the presidential elections in next year. But what would be the topics that would mark the entrance of the Latino vote in the electoral process? Is it immigration? Is it the exterior political in relationship between Venezuela, Mexico, Central America? Do you think what would be the impact for the Latin America political? I'm not a specialist in those topics, but I think the immigration topic is probably the most important because it really impacts the process that immigration has on the labor force, the health systems, the economic growth and demographic, etc. So I think that there's this fan of topics that could be organized around immigration that is very huge, and that has an impact of public opinion that is very clear, because the immigration has been used to polarize the political agenda. And also it has a real impact in how things are organized, the society is organized in the United States in a larger context, like in globalization. Like, for example, the work of the Latinos has allowed this development, this economic development that is stronger for the United States and the global scene in regards to agriculture. I'm speculating a little because I don't really know the exact details of this topic, but I don't doubt that in regards to organizing this population and the needs that it has, each one is an archipelago, right? You can't talk about the Latinos like a homogeneous because it's very variety, and there's a lot of variety, and they have different trajectories in migration, and there's different stories. But you can tell that when Trump decides to close the TPS to Central America, what rose from that, the analysis that was done on the population, which I thought was 900,000 or maybe a million immigrants that were coming at the beginning of the 21st century, that they were organized and they had really assimilated very well into the society. They were a group of immigrants that had credit and real value to the citizenship, so it was a real absurd value. That takes me to a question that I have that I wanted to ask you. What could journalism do to tell better the stories of immigrants, to tell stories that help people understand the polarizing topics like immigration or racial or other polarizing topics? What could they do? What could you guys do? I think that there's angles in each story. The angle of the story is very important to for a lecturer or a reader from a different culture to understand what a different culture is experiencing. The stories that are being told, I believe that like Faro in Central America, and Alianza with Univision, the journalist that has covered the caravans, the migration caravans, is top quality because it has a different focus from the standard of information that has predominantly existed in the United States. There's this deep search for the testimonies of the causes that motivates immigrants. There's this focus on the human story within the context of this political, violent, complex of understanding plainly the reader for the average reader in the United States, because there's different levels of reading, but and grades of reading for the readers, but to understand the Central American violence, the gangs, it's important to do work in articles like the one that Oscar Martinez, El Faro, has done, or Carlos Martinez or Carlos Dada, just citing three names that come to mind, or the perspective that was offered by an opinion article of Sonia Nazario of the New York Times, which had different levels of closeness to the problem. They try to see it from a 360-degree point view, to capture a very challenging thing that it is to capture, which is the story that is many times forgotten. And it has its origins in the United States, not necessarily in Honduras or in El Salvador. So to reconstruct all of that, you need a journalism that has a lot of vision and quality, and a journalism that needs resources, needs money to be able to do that. And so that's the weakest link in this chain, is the financing of journalism, because, well, getting to a point where you establish an audience that's looking for that quality, but is ample enough to say, to model, to have a business model and subscription, or for it to work, to finance that kind of journalism, is difficult. And so that's where I think it's important to focus the topic and to find more creative ways to fund journalism through foundations, associations with research organizations, and there's different models that could be practiced. When I saw the title of this event, when we were talking about the era of polarization, it made me think of the conversation about autocapitalization and the wave. There's been instead of having more democracy. I'm sorry, I can't hear her. I find that these processes are slow, gradual, and eroding. And in regards to the debating topic, in regards to losing these political spaces where you can find consensus, and is definitely related to this issue of polarization, where civil spaces are restricted, where you go establishing, controlling to the mediums from, so polarization works from the power, yes, where people in power take the democratic power to create this mechanism of polarization to erode democracy. And within that, it seems like the mediums arrive late. There's this that like they arrive late to understand what is happening in your story, in your experience, this polarization that seems to be a strategy to erode political. How do you do this? How do you create a system where you can defend the confidence of the political mediums, which is the most important thing? How do we do that? How do we learn that? What have you learned? How do we learn that? That's hard to simplify because you have to gather
que se respondió en un inicio a la amenaza hegemónica.
Information
Por ejemplo, en el caso venezolano,
about what has
Hugo
been.
Chávez, ¿no? El caso de Estados Unidos es diferente porque a pesar de que
Sorry, I'm having a hard
hay
time.
un populismo
In Latin America, it's been challenging because there's this populism
pleno auge,
out in the open.
los medios creo que
The
han respondido
mediums
de
have
una manera
responded in a different
diferente.
way.
No digo que
I'm not saying that they've been able to escape polarization because that would be very challenging.
se puede, pero
It could be done, but it would take a lot of work.
pero creo que se han
But
defendido un poco mejor
they've defended themselves a little bit better with the tools, their own journalism tools, the research, the investigating of the facts,
el
the
desarrollo
development
de una postura periodística
of the journalism role, independent journalistic role. And we see that
pestes
all of these problems
que se generan a partir
that
de
are generating after the insurgence of these,
muy
the
dominantes
insurgency of these figures that are very dominant in in politics, and the relationship that is created or established with the mediums or the public community in Venezuela, for example.
90
In the 1990s or in the beginning of the 1990s, the owners of the mediums thought they were the owners of the country, right? And so they would put or take down a president. They had done it with Carlos Andrés Pérez, another democratic elected president that was the great protagonist of that great moment that I spoke about before in Caracas. And in the end, it ended up to be he was destitute to be impeached in 1993, and he brought in this insurgence of Hugo Chavez. The mediums thought they dominated the political scene completely, so much
el impeachment
because they propagated the impeachment and actively propagating it way more than just being journalistic with organized campaigns against that president. And
a ver que se me no que
I'm sorry, I don't want to lose the idea.
y lo que sucedió
What
después
ended up
con Hugo
happening
Chávez,
with Hugo Chavez eventually?
solo tengo experiencia
I
primera
have
mano,
first-hand experience because I was close to some of the medium directors that thought that that they could use Chavez
para imponer sus agendas
to push their own agendas and continue to do and undo the way they had always done. And it wasn't like that. Chavez was way more smarter than that. He was able to use his popularity, his power as a president to confront the mediums and make them the enemy,
volverlos un
to make them a stereotype. He managed to do that and to really exile the mediums and use an aggressive discourse, this fascist discourse, to create this polarization in his way, in his own way.
repíteme la última parte de la
So
pregunta
repeat that last part of the question so that,
era muy amplia.
because it was very big. What could be done in regards to the medium to fight the polarization? I think that there's a lot that could be done, which is the most principal thing that I would like to underline here. The mediums can cut out through the noise, and I think that that's not a metaphor. I think that that's a reality, that they can organize information according to the standards, the quality standards that should be high and very cared for. The mediums could help the people, the lecturers, lecturers, the viewers, like we like to call them, to have a perspective that is more calibrated and closer to the reality within an environment that's full of noise and propaganda. Obviously, that happens through a condition that is very important, and that is that the medium which is sharing the information has to be credible. They have to have a credibility that is very high, that could break through the polarization, and that's another issue. But I think that the contribution that the mediums can use can have, no matter where they are in the spectrum, as long as they're not on one of the extremes in regards to a relatively moderate spectrum, you could reach a lot, establish a democratic community to be able to keep sensibility and keep the common good at hand, so that polarization creates, because polarization creates an altered state that really forces people to question what the reality is, because it takes the political and to such an extreme that it destroys civility and the opportunity to have conversation, political discourse. And so people do not talk through reality any longer. They talk through ideologies. And so I think that there has to be a greater investment in keeping the mediums more focused on reality and out of the polarization. When you started talking about the moments that had marked your trajectory, you used a phrase that I wrote down. You said that Chavez had been a great fiction. 40 years after the successes that 30 years. Yes, 30, just 30. We're not that young. 30 years later, Chavez is a fictional character. You were invited to the fair of the book in Quito, which is next month. And in that fair, the greater author that has been invited will be Rodrigo Blanco Calderón, which just won the Nobel Prize, which is a novel written during Chavism time, 2009, 2010, when the electric shutdowns will happen. And in the fairs of Quito would be who has a novel that has a protagonist that is Chavista, and really exiles and militarism. Chavism has become this great story, this fictional characters. And in a Venezuelan literature, the narrative, because poetry has had a different trajectory, but the narrative seems to be starting to internationalize itself as Hugo Chavez as a character. How do you see this process of fictionalizing Chavism or describing this narrative of Chavism? Well, the pathology is a great literatural topic. And so I think that if we're talking about this, there is this chain of narrative fiction that has Chavez inside, in front, behind, or subliminal. It's just all over. In 2006, before this, all of this that we're seeing now, up until this Calderón and Rodrigo Blanco, Juan Pablo Mendez Gay, which studied with me at the communication school, and I've read some of them, but I can't really speak to them. Chavez begins to become this literature character, Venezuelan one, because I think it extrapolates. If you extrapolate, Trump is going to be a literary character as well, or he has been. I mean, yeah, he has been. Yeah, the plot against America. I'm losing the name. Roth. Philip Roth.
hay asuntos que
There
tienen que ver
are issues that
que
have to
tienen que ver
do
con la
with
patología.
the pathology.
Y
And
me gustaría
I would
decir
like to say,
que en este sentido me
in
viene a la
this
mente una frase
sense, I'm getting
John
this phrase that comes
Kenneth
to my
Galbraith,
head from Kenneth
famoso economista
Galbraith,
liberal
the famous
de Estados Unidos,
liberal
que
economist
decía
from the United
que
States,
si
that would
algo se
say
sabe del
that if you
caos
know one thing about chaos,
es que es bueno
is that it's good
para el capitalismo,
for
para
the
el
for
mercado.
capitalism,
Si
for the
algo se
market.
sabe
If you
de las
know
figuras
something about
eh,
figures,
patológicas,
pathological figures
extravagantes,
that are extravagant,
demasiado vinculadas con la locura,
way
es que
too
dan
attached
mucho
to
para
madness,
contar, ¿no?
there would be a
Entonces no me
lot to tell.
sorprende
So I'm not
mucho que se centren en
surprised
Chávez,
that they
que
would
utilicen
be
este
focused
periodo
on
de
Chavez, or
20
that they
años,
would use
porque
these
es un
20
apocalipsis.
years,
Y de los
because it's an
apocalipsis, bueno, ya
apocalypse.
sabemos
And we
que
know
hay
that
un
in
libro de la Biblia
apocalypse,
que se
there's
llama
a
Apocalipsis.
book in the Bible that's called Apocalypse, the
Necesitan
Revelations.
ser
They
narrados
need to
para
be
de alguna manera
narrated
buscar una elaboración
to find
simbólica,
these
imaginaria, que
this
ayude a la
collaboration,
gente a un poco
symbolic
comprender
or literary, that helps people
pero
understand their
no sé, no tengo
situation. But I
una
don't
visión más
have
elaborada que
a
eso,
more elaborative
porque, o
vision
sea,
than
me parece
that.
que
I think that
obviamente
obviously
Venezuela se ha internacionalizado
Venezuela
también,
has
y esto es muy importante porque
internationalized
los
itself
escritores han
very
por fin salido de
importantly.
Venezuela.
There's been writers leaving Venezuela, right? And so the exile has forced people to be in Spain, in France, in the United States, in Argentina, in Mexico. And so that also produces an exportation. There's this effect on the literary market because there's a different exertion. One of the first works of the Venezuelan literary was that it was very local, and in part it was because the writers weren't very really centralized in the political systems, and now they are. And so of course La Isla del Española is going to be very successful because it tells a story of a damned country, and the writer is in Madrid, where big literary companies are. I think that I'm sorry. I think we are going. I'm sorry. I think I got rid of all of your questions. It was wonderful because questions that we had gotten rid of because we had a lot of questions. You answered them, and it was like almost everything that we prepared were covered, but not in the order that we had prepared them in the disorder. So it was marvelous because it was more like a conversation. So I thought it was very good. So Erica? Are there any questions? We can go around. Thank you, both of you, for this excellent conversation. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to ask only two. Number one, I'd like to sort of mention Boom, which is very captivating and could also be insurged by by Chavez. Yeah, Chavez is waiting for that novella, that soap opera. So my questions were one, the mediums in regards to polarization mentioned, how were they projected towards dictators, the populist of the left and the right? Sometimes I have the impression that it's very difficult for journalists to confront or question a left populism, because in one way it sounds like they're questioning the very values that those populists defend, or they say they defend. Obviously they don't defend them, but like issues of minorities or democracy. How do you see journalism, or do you feel that there is a proximity to the criticism of the left or the right? That would be my first question. And then the second one would be the exile, Venezuelan exile. That's the political sort of position to that, not a diaspora. There's a political association to this institution, to this state where these people are being displaced. So how does journalism have to do, what does journalism have to do with this type of situation nowadays, the exiling of Venezuelans? Well, in regards to the populism and how is populism covered from left to right, I think that really what's happened in Latin America more than anything, which is different from the United States, it's very difficult because one of the first mechanisms, not the first, but one of the mechanisms that are established by political leaders, for example, Chavez or Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner or Rafael Correa, is they limit the access to information through the creation of new legal markets for communication. So they create these filters, even though they claim to be forming a new entity. They're creating this filter to create this blitzing of the government. And that's a reality. And we've seen it happen in Argentina, where a medium law was created that had some positive aspects, but it also had very negative aspects in regards to control of information. And established in Venezuela first. It was established in Venezuela first, where the law impedes the access, the journalistic access to the fountains of the governing fountains of information that could create a vision of what happens inside of the state apparatus. Because the idea is to really get rid of transparency. And in Ecuador, there was a higher has paragraphs in it and whole passages copied from the Venezuelan law, where one state copies a complete law from another state, which is a total gravity. And Rafael Correa in Ecuador ordered his ministers not to speak to the mediums because he was having a frank war with the Universe, El Universo, which is a newspaper, an Ecuadorian newspaper, which he even sued some journalists for millions of dollars. I had to go to Ecuador to those days to go report on those situations, and I interviewed Correa, and he's a very interesting personality. He had a very strong script that he was stuck to, and he was trying to find the objective that would make himself look like a magnetic leader, because even after winning the lawsuits, which if I'm not mistaken were worth more than $10 million against different journalists that didn't even have a car, he ended up forgiving them because he had this very magnetic, messianic type style to him. So it's very hard because of the lack of transparency and, of course, the ideological point of view, because one of the constant qualifications being reported, first, because it's supposed to be filtered through political mediums within a medium war, like in Venezuela or Ecuador or Argentina. And secondly, because these leaders are good. They're supposed to be good. And so being that good, only the people that criticize them respond to the interest of deep states or of economic sectors or the economic elite. So that makes it very difficult. Just like the right. Bolsonaro today in Brazil is launching actions that are very brutal against the environment, against the environmental protections, and has tried to disqualify the mediums that are reporting on that. He went to United Nations and said it was false. And so there's this pain for the truth. There's this pain for the dominion of a narrative. And the hardest part is conserving a central topic that is true, to say truthfully that ethically there is a social value around and a consensus that the truth is positive, that has to be conserved, working very arduously every day. And yet there's always going to be some symmetry because power, the electoral power, the presidents are managing this apparatus that is very big in front of the mediums. And of course, how big, no matter how big they are, the mediums, they're small compared to that power. Did I answer both of your questions? I believe you did. Yeah, we'll go back. Good afternoon. My name is Manuel Jimenez, and I live here in Providence for many years. I want to ask you, I've heard many things about Venezuela through the mediums and through people that I know. And I wanted to ask you, what are the positive aspects that you see out of Chavism in Venezuela? I think that there's a positivity to a positive aspect to Chavism, and that is the aspect, the level of discourse, because the Chavism aspect has recuperated the narrative of the marginalized. It tried to find a place for the discourse about poverty to be addressed, where the elites, in a country where the elites had their backs turned to the poor, and even in their lifestyles, there was this obsession with the imported things produced in the United States, this idea that it wasn't just about Chavez, but before Chavez, where Venezuelans were members of this tribe, this consumerist tribe called the Tabaratos, which indicates that there was this country that, even though it was rich, there was something that wasn't working, right? And so I think Chavez squared that off in a political discourse, which he monopolized to a certain fact. And those elites left in his hands, and I think that's a positive aspect to Chavism. A more concrete aspect would be that in one way the economic transfers of Chavism had a positive impact on pushing out the consumerism that was of the poor and bettered the quality of life for a short time for Venezuelans. But that wasn't accompanied by structural mediums that would have made it better. So that was something that was short-lived. That abundance lasted less than 10 years, 9 years to be exact, where people filled themselves with assets, cars, consumerism, air conditioners, refrigerators, travel. But after that, there was nothing, because there was no good education behind it, no product, no system that was productive. There was no businesses launched. Businesses were destroyed like never before. The economic destruction that came with that consumerism, because really at the end of it, there was just this issue of power, of just gaining power, amassing power, and that was Chavez project. He was obsessed with power. He had an enormous charisma. He was a man that understood what was popular, and he came from this extract that was very popular. He wasn't a statesman. He wasn't thinking about the future of a country 30, 40 years later, more or less after his protagonism as the center of this history. I think that answers the question. Can I ask another one? Aquí. Within that context of what Chavez did that was positive, compared with those prior governments that maintained millions of people marginalized. Which of the two do you believe was
Yo creo
is
que
better
el
for
sistema anterior fue muchísimo, infinitamente mejor.
the people in general? The system before was way better than Chavez. I'll tell you a story. Both systems are established on getting rich off of petroleum. During Chavez, 9-10 years had the greatest abundance of in all of Latin America. There was almost $1 trillion that came into Venezuela, for which Chavez group stole in their pockets $518 million, which they recognized themselves. The officials that managed the Chavism economy admitted to. Venezuela prior to Chavez had a bunch of problems, like the 1970s, where there was this period, 1975-76, the nationalization of the petroleum, until 88, 89. There was this period that was short, really, of time. There was a country where it developed more its education, had more streets, more beds in the hospitals, more universities were created, and sent generations of students to other countries to get educated. It wasn't perfect, but it also, there was a level of livelihood that was a lot better than the other Latin American countries. So let's just say that the comparison speaks for itself. Thank you. Can I ask a question? Within this panorama, we talk of Brazil, Ecuador, Argentina. Within or outside of Latin America, is there a liberated way of thought that is worth following? In Latin America? Well, yeah. There is journalists, quality journalism. I think that journalism in Latin America is the best one that's ever been done, but it's an autocratic one. There's mediums that still require a lot more platforms that are not just because they have a website, but there's like technological resources and natural resources that are lacking in Latin America during a time like now, when the best level of journalism, the best level of journalism, but there isn't the platform to make that journalism national or international, which we managed to do with the New York Times in Spanish. We brought the Latin American problem to a regional scale for all of the countries. And so that can be done without the necessity of a lot of money, but you do need a platform. You need a brand, you need credibility, which is what New York Times brought to Latin America. So I think, like I said before, that in regards to the Latin public, the Hispanic public in the United States, there's a problem with vision. There's obviously mediums that are quality, that are part of mainstream media, they're not the best, but there is this real effort, like La Nación, the Nation, or Globo, or Foro San Paulo's, newspapers like Reforma in Mexico, that up until a certain point are influenced by the powers, the major powers, the models of business models. They are still offering a certain level of quality journalists, like the magazine Proceso. In all places, we find these small examples, but what we don't see is this alliance that is strong enough to bring this journalism to transcend to another level. I don't know. It's good to say from this position because I don't have any real responsibilities. I apologize. I just arrived. In regards to how to finance, I understand the New York Times in Spanish has closed its doors, and I know that how do we launch financial streams so that there are. I don't think that it's impossible, and I don't think that that's the problem for New York Times in Spanish. I think that we have to create models that are functional business models that can feed off various streams of revenue from various revenue streams of income or just a functioning. Some could be non-for-profit or establish models that are different and are functional so that there's a development of journalism that is strategic. It's very complex, but I think that journalism has many limits. And so you can elect the limit where you stand. For example, to say it based on experience, the New York Times in Spanish placed itself at a high level, which fed off of the other levels. Like, for example, the journalism that was quality and that was done within Latin America. Overall, in opinion, it was very clear because opinion is not just in journalism, but in academics or intellectual or business, intellectual public. And it's a lot clearer, the New York Times in Spanish, because in opinion, we were the ones that produced the most original content. But I don't think that obviously we do need money, but I don't think that it is something impossible or you have to reinvent the wheel. I think that what we need is a commitment, a long commitment to help bring forth this to a point, to a level, a height that would have cruising altitude. And that will take a few years. But in Latin America, there are capitals, there's money. There are people that believe there's this new elite, globalized, that understands a little bit, and put that in quotes, a little bit better of what the world today is. And so we have to find those sectors, those progressive sectors, and to commit to projects that are trying to bring civil discourse that keep alive the public atmosphere. Of course, that's just something else. It's not just business. We're hungry. Thank you very much. Thank you, Iria, for your questions. I will think a lot about them tonight.